Josef Fritzel was born in 1935 in Amstetten, Austria. He married in the 1950s and later became the father of 7 children. One of them was his daughter, Elisabeth Fritzel, born in 1966. Fritzel had a documented criminal history. In 1967, he was convicted of rape and served a prison sentence. After his release, he resumed family life and remained largely unremarkable to those around him. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, Fritzel began constructing a concealed cellar beneath his family home. The space was hidden behind reinforced doors and accessible only through locked entry points. The construction took place gradually and without raising suspicion. On August 28, 1984, Elisabeth Fritzel, then 18 years old, was lured into the cellar by her father under the pretense of helping with household work. Once inside, she was drugged and restrained. The door was sealed behind her. Elisabeth would remain imprisoned in the cellar for the next 24 years. The underground space consisted of a small living area with no windows and limited ventilation. Fritzel controlled access to food, light, and movement. Elisabeth had no contact with the outside world. Over the course of her captivity, Fritzel repeatedly raped her. Between 1988 and 2002, Elisabeth gave birth to 7 children while imprisoned. One child died shortly after birth. Fritzel later admitted to cremating the infant's body. 3 of the children remained in the cellar with Elisabeth. They were raised entirely underground, never leaving the confined space. They had no exposure to daylight, schooling, or normal social interaction. The remaining 3 children were removed from the cellar as infants. Fritzel presented them to his wife as abandoned grandchildren, claiming Elisabeth had joined a cult and could not care for them. These children were raised in the main household above the cellar. Throughout the 24 years of imprisonment, Fritzel's wife and neighbors remained unaware of the cellar's existence. Fritzel maintained a strict system of secrecy and control. In April 2008, one of the children raised in the cellar, Kirsten, became critically ill. Fritzel brought her to a hospital. Medical staff questioned her condition and demanded information about her mother. Police were notified. On April 26, 2008, authorities searched the Fritzel home. They discovered the concealed cellar beneath the property. Elisabeth and 3 of her children were found alive. Josef Fritzel was arrested and later confessed to imprisoning and raping his daughter for over 2 decades. In 2009, Fritzel was tried in an Austrian court. He pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including rape, incest, enslavement, false imprisonment, and negligent homicide. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Elisabeth Fritzel and her surviving children were given new identities and placed under long-term state protection. Their locations and personal details have been kept private. Josef Fritzel remains incarcerated in Austria. Sylvia Likens was born in 1949 in Indianapolis, Indiana. She was one of several children born to Lester and Betty Likens, who worked traveling carnival jobs. Due to their work, the family frequently relied on others for temporary childcare. In the summer of 1965, Sylvia and her younger sister, Jenny, were placed in the care of Gertrude Banishevsky. Banishevsky lived in Indianapolis with her 7 children. She agreed to care for the girls in exchange for weekly payments from their parents. Shortly after the girls arrived, Banishevsky began abusing Sylvia. The payments from the Likens' parents were inconsistent, and Banishevsky expressed resentment toward Sylvia as a result. The abuse initially took the form of verbal humiliation and physical punishment. Over time, the abuse escalated. Sylvia was isolated from others in the home and denied adequate food. She was beaten repeatedly and subjected to prolonged mistreatment. Jenny, who had a physical disability, was unable to protect her sister and was threatened when she attempted to intervene. Banishevsky encouraged her own children to participate in the abuse. Neighborhood children were also allowed into the home and took part. Multiple individuals were involved over an extended period. Sylvia was eventually confined to the basement of the house. She was prevented from attending school and denied medical care despite visible injuries. Witnesses later testified that the abuse became routine and normalized within the household. Despite her condition, no effective intervention occurred. Adults outside the home were either unaware of the situation or failed to report it. On October 26, 1965, Sylvia Likens collapsed in the Banishevsky home. Emergency services were contacted, but she was pronounced dead shortly afterward. She was 16 years old. An autopsy determined that Sylvia Likens died from severe malnutrition, infection, and extensive injuries caused by prolonged abuse. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. Police investigations revealed the extent of the abuse and the number of individuals involved. Gertrude Banishevsky and several others were arrested and charged. In 1966, Banishevsky was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Several of her children and other participants received convictions on lesser charges and were sentenced to prison terms. Banishevsky was later paroled in 1985. She died in 1990. The Sylvia Likens case drew national attention and remains one of the most widely cited examples of prolonged child abuse involving multiple perpetrators. David Parker Ray was born in 1939 in New Mexico. He spent much of his adult life living in the small town of Truth or Consequences. He worked as a mechanic and was known locally as quiet and technically skilled. Beginning in the late 1950s, Ray developed a long-standing pattern of violent sexual fantasies. Over time, he began acting on them. Ray abducted women, often from bars or public areas, using deception or force. He transported them to a soundproof trailer located on his property. He referred to this trailer as his toy box. Inside the trailer, Ray restrained victims and used drugs to keep them unconscious or disoriented. When victims regained awareness, they were often unable to recall how they had arrived or where they were being held. Ray recorded audio tapes that described his control over the victims and the abuse he intended to commit. These recordings were played repeatedly. Investigators later described the recordings as instructional and methodical. Ray did not act alone. He was assisted by accomplices, most notably his girlfriend, Cindy Handy. Handy helped lure victims, restrain them, and release them after Ray was finished. At times, Ray's daughter was also implicated in assisting with certain aspects of the crimes. Victims were often held for extended periods, then released after being drugged again. Many survivors were unable to identify Ray or report the crimes due to memory loss caused by the drugs. Despite the length of time over which the crimes occurred, no confirmed bodies were recovered. Investigators believe this contributed to Ray's ability to avoid detection for decades. The exact number of victims remains unknown. In March 1999, one victim regained partial consciousness while being transported by Cindy Handy. She escaped the vehicle and flagged down a passing motorist. Police were contacted. Law enforcement searched Ray's property and discovered the soundproof trailer. Inside, they found restraints, recording equipment, and extensive evidence of prolonged criminal activity. Ray was arrested and charged with multiple counts of kidnapping and sexual assault. Handy was also arrested and later convicted for her role as an accomplice. Ray never stood trial. In May 2002, while in custody, David Parker Ray died of a heart attack at the age of 62. Because no bodies were found and many victims were unable to testify, prosecutors were unable to determine the full scope of Ray's crimes. Gabriel Fernandez was born in 2005 in Los Angeles County, California. Throughout his early childhood, Gabriel lived in unstable conditions. He was placed in foster care multiple times due to concerns about neglect and abuse. Teachers, relatives, and social workers raised repeated alarms regarding his safety. In 2012, when Gabriel was 8 years old, custody was returned to his biological mother, Fernandez. She lived with her boyfriend, Isauro Aguirre, in Palmdale, California. After returning to the home, Gabriel's behavior and physical condition began to change. Teachers observed bruises, injuries, and signs of malnourishment. Gabriel disclosed abuse to school staff and was described as fearful and withdrawn. Between 2012 and 2013, multiple reports were made to the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services. Social workers visited the home several times. Despite visible injuries and repeated warnings from mandated reporters, Gabriel remained in the custody of his mother. Evidence later presented in court showed that Gabriel was subjected to prolonged physical abuse. He was beaten, burned, and forced to endure acts of violence over an extended period. Medical testimony described repeated injuries consistent with ongoing trauma. Gabriel was also denied adequate food and medical care. Witnesses testified that he was often confined, isolated, and treated as a burden within the household. On May 24, 2013, emergency services were called after Gabriel collapsed in the home. He was transported to a hospital, where he was pronounced dead later that day. An autopsy determined that Gabriel Fernandez died from blunt force trauma and internal bleeding. The cause of death was ruled a homicide. Medical examiners concluded that the injuries were the result of repeated abuse rather than a single incident. Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre were arrested and charged with murder and multiple counts of child abuse. Prosecutors alleged that both were responsible for the abuse, either directly or through failure to protect. During the trial, jurors heard testimony from medical experts, teachers, and investigators. Photographic evidence documented extensive injuries. The prosecution argued that Gabriel's death was preventable and that warning signs had been repeatedly ignored. In 2018, Isauro Aguirre was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances and sentenced to death. Fernandez pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Following the convictions, criminal charges were filed against several county social workers, alleging negligence and falsification of records. Those charges were later dismissed. However, the case prompted widespread public scrutiny of child protective services in Los Angeles County. Policy reviews and administrative changes were implemented in response to the failures identified in the case. Gabriel Fernandez was 8 years old. Brianna Lopez was a young child living in New Mexico in the early 2000s. She lived with her mother, Cynthia Lopez, and her mother's boyfriend, Michael Chacon. At the time of her death, Brianna was mere months old. Accounts later presented in court described a home environment marked by instability and violence. Brianna was largely dependent on the two adults for care and supervision. Over an extended period, Brianna was subjected to repeated physical abuse. Medical evidence later showed injuries in various stages of healing, indicating that the abuse was ongoing rather than isolated. Witness testimony and medical findings describe bruising, internal injuries, and signs of prolonged neglect. Despite visible injuries, Brianna was not taken to receive medical treatment. On the day emergency services were called, Brianna was unresponsive. She was transported to a hospital, where she was pronounced dead. An autopsy determined that Brianna Lopez died from blunt force trauma. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. The investigation revealed that the injuries responsible for her death were consistent with repeated acts of violence rather than an accident. Evidence suggested Brianna had been beaten in the days leading up to her death. Cynthia Lopez and Michael Chacon were arrested and charged in connection with Brianna's death. Both were accused of either directly inflicting the injuries or failing to intervene while the abuse occurred. During court proceedings, prosecutors presented medical testimony, photographs, and witness statements detailing the extent of Brianna's injuries. The case emphasized prolonged abuse and the failure of the adults in the home to protect her. Michael Chacon was convicted of murder and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Cynthia Lopez was also convicted on charges related to Brianna's death and received a significant prison sentence. The case prompted public attention in New Mexico, particularly regarding child welfare oversight and the warning signs of prolonged abuse in the home. Brianna Lopez was a child who died while under the care of those responsible for her safety.